The spirit world knows somebody is about to pass and they will be ready to make sure they're there to take them by the hand and help them with that transition, which is hugely comforting because now we know that all our loved ones who have gone on before will be back to help us at the end.
Dr. Karen Frances McCarthy, welcome to Passion Harvest. I'm so excited to have you back on the show. It's been quite a long time. Welcome.
Thank you, Louisa. I'm delighted to be back.
We have discussed, I've got so many questions for you today, and you're an incredible medium and have so many offerings. But what I'd like to start with, I guess, how your mediumship started with the death of your fiance.
Yeah, so as you know, when I was a child, this is quite common, I do think, with people. As a child, I was very familiar with sort of spirits waking up, see them at the end of the bed, talking to them, sort of alarming my mother by talking to thin air sort of thing. But then into my teens and 20s, I really had no interest in it. And I think this is quite common. It sort of fell away. So, you know, then as I grew up went to school with the nuns. And by the time I was 17 and got out of school, I'd had enough and sort of became a committed atheist then for many, many years. But then when I sort of turned 40, my partner died very suddenly one afternoon, a very sudden massive heart attack, very unexpected, very young. And that I was actually away because I had been a war correspondent. I had been in Iraq. I was back. I was actually down in Virginia. I was writing a book that was part of the Northern Ireland peace process for the Northern, you know, cultural contribution to that. And I was down in Virginia, staying in this creepy little house in an attic, which all sounds very kind of creepy, but it was actually converted, but still sounds better. But by myself, just sort of house sitting while I was writing and doing some interviews in the South, when I got the phone call that he had suddenly died. And I think that particularly when somebody's very young like that, when it's completely or any age when it's completely unexpected, the sort of the nervous system goes into that state of shock. And so what started happening at that point was all electricity, lights turning on, things moving, you know, all of these weird things that go on. And I was sort of on my own in this big hulking house in Virginia thinking, I've lost my mind. You know, this is grief. I've lost my mind. I don't know why the bed is sort of not rocking, but shimmying, and you know, why the lights are turning on, electronics were turning on, all sorts of mad things were going on. I was seeing black figures. I wrote about it. I wrote a book eventually on this called Till Death Don't Us Part, which we've talked about before. All of this happening. And of course, in the grief state, and I know a lot of people get into this state when they're in their grief, and this starts happening. The first thought is, I'm having a breakdown. The grief has driven me to a breakdown. And fortunately for me, though, I actually was led from one to the other of very helpful people, beginning, believe it or not, with a Catholic priest, who kind of helped me to eventually realize that this wasn't some kind of grief-induced nervous disorder, that this was actually quite normal in many cases for our loved ones in the afterlife to let us know they are still there. And it was a very, very difficult turn to make for me. I mean, I'd been a practicing Zen Buddhist, but Zen is non-theistic. So, you know, I really couldn't get my head around this. So I started doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of people, starting to pay attention to all of these things that were going on. And then it just sort of, I won't give away the aha moment, the sort of epiphany that came to me, because if anyone wants to read the book, then it'll sort of ruin the book for them. But it came one day where everything sort of reached a critical mass, where I had that sort of epiphany. Oh my God, this is him. You know, this is him. And so that was one of those moments where there's no going back. You don't know, you're sort of in that sort of space of, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea. All of the things that I took for granted, you know, all of the reality, the nature of order, all of these things gone out the window. Now, all of a sudden, you're back to what the Buddhists call beginner's mind, having to really look at the world with a very, very different lens, and start to really think in a very, very different way about it. And so, of course, what I learned to do from there was to develop a language. Well, we together developed a language where we could continue our relationship. Now, obviously, it's not the same because one's in spirit form, one's in physical form, but certainly there are ways to continue those relationships. So this continued on, and we've sort of over the years then sort of developed this new way of being able to be sort of present together, which has just been a massive, massive learning curve. So, but very interesting learning curve. And then, of course, what started happening as that was going on was other people's relatives would pop in. So I'd be sitting with somebody and somebody would sort of pop in, and I would just make sure the person I was sitting with was okay first, receiving this information ethically. Obviously, you need to do that. And if I felt the person was open to learning about the person who had sat beside me and identifying who it was, I would share with them. And so some absolutely extraordinary and very healing stories came out of that. Of, you know, a mother who had died by suicide came and sat with me while I was sitting with her daughter's friend on the day of her anniversary. And so, you know, being able to give all of this information about how she felt was incredibly healing for the family. And so a lot of this started happening, and a few people started encouraging me to actually do this for other people. Not just for me, it was just between me and him for quite a while. And then other people started saying that, no, it's incredibly helpful to other people. You should really do something with it. And so, as you know, I thought, well, God, you know, I really don't want to just sit in front of vulnerable people and start giving them information without really, really knowing what I'm doing. So it's one thing to have the awareness, and it's one thing to receive information. It's an entirely other thing to be really fully educated about that, and educated about grief, so that when you sit in front of somebody who's in that very vulnerable position, you are really properly trained, properly educated to be able to sort of meld that with the awareness of their spirit. So I studied grief counselling. I spent many years training and doing education courses at the Arthur Findlay College in England as well, to get to the point. And so I ended up then, you know, sort of going from being this sort of diehard skeptic and war correspondent to all of a sudden now here I am, you know, sitting down and mediating conversations between the dearly departed and their loved ones. And I mean, nobody, no, you know, anybody who knew me before, when they meet me now, they're going, what on earth? What on earth?
Incredible. From an atheist war correspondent to a full-blown medium. It's
yeah. It's like when it comes back on, that's it. Just sort of the doors blew open and that was it. Yeah.
So I always get asked this, but how do you sense, feel, or do you see the non-physical beings or the loved ones that want to communicate with their family members?
You know, for children, it's very spontaneous. Children are great at actually seeing the, you know, manifestations of the spirit. I think as adults, that becomes very rarer and rarer. I think children are much more on that cusp of not so long out of the spirit world. So I saw a lot of physical manifestations of the spirit as a child. I have a friend whose son is the same, who as a toddler would put his hands up to empty space for somebody to pick him up and freak her out completely, you know. So I know with children, it's very, very natural thing. I know from myself, you know, wouldn't be able to tell the difference between if I was talking to a spirit person or my mother, or, you know, a real person as a child. The same thing happens for people who are on the cusp of departing. So when I've sat around people's deathbeds, you become very much aware that there's a gathering of loved ones with them. But you can see, and anybody who's sitting with somebody who's about to transition, you'll probably see that they'll start actually looking into the empty spaces between people around the bed, because they're seeing the loved ones in spirit standing next to their loved ones here. So when we're on the cusp of entering and exiting, seems very manifestation, that very, very, very real looking presence is felt. In between that, it is very sort of, I think, unique experience, but there are common denominators. So for instance, somebody doesn't, very rarely will I actually just have a completely random person being aware of a completely random person. It serves no purpose. The spirit world is intelligent. It doesn't, there's no point in manifesting to somebody for absolutely no reason. And so usually there's going to be a reason for it. So normally it's going to happen because they're aware that you're talking to their loved one and they want to get a word in. Now, the more training and discipline you get in your mediumship, the less that just sort of spontaneously happens. So what happens now, for example, in at this point in my mediumship development is if I'm sitting with somebody and they want to talk to somebody, literally, it's very, very simple. People think this is a really complicated thing. It's actually a very simple thing. You literally turn your awareness. So I'm talking to you this moment, and I just then turn my awareness to who else? And that's literally, it's almost like just a curiosity. Oh, who wants to talk to Louisa? Okay. And they're there. So I'm a huge advocate of starting to think in very 21st century ways about mediumship, about consciousness, about continuity, about the nature of reality. And I know I talked to you before about the research I did in my doctorate, very much focused on looking at the sort of critical mass that we have reached in different fields to really start to think differently about this. I think it's really important that we understand that we're all in the superconscious. We're all in the same stream of consciousness. And mediumship can be as simple as turning your awareness. And when you become aware, you're saying basically, okay, I'm listening. And then that person, the spirit person, will start sharing fleeting images, some images, sounds, words, feelings very much. Sometimes it's the psychic senses that you hear people talking about, using clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience. There's also claircognition, which is you just sort of know. You're just sort of sitting there and you just know. You just become so attuned to them that what they know, you just sort of know, because the blend of mind to mind is so close. And you can just start sharing things from their vantage point that you just suddenly know. So it sounds a bit mysterious, but it's actually, I'm a big advocate of normalizing this. Probably sounds a bit contradictory.
No,
but sort of
wonderful.
treating that conversation the same way as we treat this conversation. It's like if you're in a conversation with three people, one person's talking, you're listening to them. The next person starts talking, you turn your awareness and you start listening to them. So I really do try to normalize mediumship. Take the superstition out. Superstition is no place in mediumship. It's a very, very natural, very loving, very compassionate, and very normal way of being. I mean, we understand from a lot of the work of the consciousness theorists now that the prevailing theory is that while we are in the physical body, the brain is acting like an antenna to tune in our particular droplet of consciousness. So when that antenna breaks, for example, when we die, the consciousness still exists. It's like the radio. You tune the radio into, you turn the knob in the old days, you turn the knob to tune in a particular frequency to get a radio signal. Then you break the radio, but the signal is still there. And I think it's important that we take away a lot of this superstition, because I've seen people, particularly the bereaved who are very vulnerable, get very, very distressed by superstitions. By old superstitions that have been carried through fiction for thousands of years that actually aren't true. I think it's important to challenge those beliefs and to start realizing that this is a very, very normal thing, that our loved ones are aware, are present all the time. That doesn't mean they're sort of hanging out with us all the time. But it's like when we start to think about this in a much more normal way, it's like you get on with your life. You go out to work, you come home, you call your friend, somebody's there at the dinner. You know, it's a very normal way of being. So we get on with our lives. But then if you wanted to talk to your mother and you called out for your mother, you said mother, of course she's going to listen, you know, unless do you know what I mean? Your mother's going to be there. She's going to say yes or make her presence felt. And I think it's important that we realize that this is very seamless. It's quite a seamless connection, and it's quite very, very it's filled with love and kindness and compassion. So ideas, I hear people say, oh, if you keep talking to your loved one, you're holding them back. And I'm like, holding them back from what?
Beautiful, simple way of explaining it. I know you have a course on this, but what are your tips or tools for the humans, us, to connect with their loved ones or notice signs, symbols, or synchronicities from our dearly departed?
Yeah, so I think part of it is, believe it or not, as simple as doing attunement practice and meditation practices, because the more still and quiet we can be, and the more sort of we are in a closer sense of harmony, the less chatter there is in our own head. And the less chatter there is in our own head, the more space there is then for our loved ones to touch our mind, for example. I often say to my students, it's like if you keep talking, it's like talking to somebody who won't shut up. How can you get a word in? So if we can be still and deal with a lot of the grief, it's not that the grief has anything to do with it, because grief is love, right? But it's the anxiety. The anxiety and the grief can make us like monkey minds, where there's no space. So if we can start to learn to work on our own healing, to relax, to trust, we have a little bit more stillness within ourselves, which is very good for us, but also a little bit of space then for our loved ones. So a lot of, you can get books and they'll have lists of a robin's a sign, a feather's a sign, a penny's a sign, and stuff like that. But what I would say is that's all very well, but the signs are going to be as unique to you as your conversation with your loved one was. So your conversation, your relationship with your spouse, for instance, particularly unique to you two, is going to be different from your neighbor's relationship with their spouse. And so I think it's important to start looking for what has their mark on it, as Rumi says. What sign has their mark on it, right? So in my book, for example, I talk about butterflies. So butterflies are a big thing. Oh, but if you see a butterfly, it's your loved one, right? And somebody said, this is in my memoir, but somebody said to me, oh, ask him for a butterfly, then, and I thought, if you knew how sort of sardonic my partner had been, you would go, if he sent a butterfly, something that delicate, no way in hell would I ever recognize him in it, right? And the minute I said that, I got bombarded by butterflies. I mean, hundreds. It wasn't one, hundreds of. I mean, they were crashing into me. They were landing on me, because that's the sort of sarcastic sense of humor he had. And so that, to me, had his mark on it. And so I think it's important for people the most important thing is to trust your loved one, and to trust your relationship, because the relationships never end. Death cannot end a relationship, right? And so if your person was a particular way or had a particular thing, like people say, oh, you see pennies. Well, if I saw a penny, I wouldn't associate that with anything. But my granddad, if I saw pennies now, since my granddad passed, I'd be like, oh, that could be my granddad, because when I was a kid, he used to always give us a penny when we went to visit him. So there's going to be some connection. So I would say, really, more than anything, talk to your loved one, trust your loved one. They can hear your thoughts. They can always hear. I know some people get really unnerved by that. What do you mean? They can hear my thoughts. But I think, isn't that a fantastic testimonial to unconditional love? Because can you imagine if everybody could hear all our thoughts all the time? We'd all be like, oh no, I don't want somebody to know that about me, or whatever, And now all of a sudden there's no secrets, because everything's there for them. And people often get very uncomfortable about that. Oh my God, I don't want them to know I did that when I was 16 to whatever, But I think it's a massive testimonial to unconditional love, because they can see every single thing about you, all the secrets, all the things you've been hiding, all the warts and all. They can see all of that, and they still love you. Isn't that beautiful? That is unconditional
and
love.
so comforting. I mean, to
Yeah.
know that our loved ones are still there with us.
But it's also, I find
Not
it's
in the
very
physical,
freeing.
but sorry.
Yeah. I find it's very freeing as well, because now all of a sudden we don't have to put energy into trying to hide parts of us. We're able to just be completely, truly ourselves, warts and all the good and the bad, and somebody accepts it, which I think is beautiful, beautiful. But that only sort of seems to exist in the spirit world. I don't know how far we could push that when we're all in the fit, because we've all got triggers and hang-ups. But in the spirit, those in spirit form are aware of all that and love us anyway, which I think is beautiful. So to come back to your question of how can people recognize their own signs? Of course, there's the things that we kind of know that you can kind of Google and get. But what I would say is try to sit, get a meditation practice or get a meditation teacher. I've got free meditations, guided meditations on my website people can go listen to. I have attunement practices which are designed to increase your sensitivity to the spirit world. But I would say do that in conjunction with some form of a meditation practice, whether it's sitting mindfulness, whether it's just moving mindfully, just to make sure that you are moving along at a pace that suits you, so you don't feel, because once we start developing our sensitivity, we're sort of open to every kid on the block, so we just want to be mindful of that and move along in developing our own sensitivity so that we're more receptive, because a lot of the time our loved one's presence is felt by just feeling it. You could be just sitting watching TV, and then this happens to me an awful lot, thankfully. I could be just sitting watching TV, for example, and then all of a sudden a feeling of just beautiful calm comes over me. And I know, it's my mother's here, right? Because that's the I always feel when my mother comes close. And so when we can move into a state where we're a little quieter in our mind, we are more open and receptive to those moments when we actually feel our loved one has drawn near. And the feeling is so much better, I find, than sort of saying, oh, there's a robin, I wonder if that's my dad or whatever. When you can actually feel that presence, when you can feel you're anxious and all of a sudden you feel this calmness, oh, thank you for that. It's much more powerful. So I would say it's important to start to develop that sort of sensitivity slowly and in a healthy way. And I, as you mentioned, I've designed a course to help people along with this. And there are little practices within that you can do to invite them in, to sense them, to ask them, different people to come in and out, so you can start to feel that as you develop sensitivity. The other things are beautiful are the synchronicities. And I think there's a lot of, some people I've noticed, and people have come to me with this, have a lot of trouble wrapping their head around the idea of a synchronicity. I just saw an image on a billboard that has great meaning for me that I associate with, my brother, for example. But how could my brother have put that billboard there? And people kind of think like this. No, that's not actually the way the synchronicity works. What happens is, same with license plates. People see license plates all the time that are significant numbers or letters on them. It's not that your loved one has plunked a car in front of you. It's what's happened is that your loved one has seen these significant signs or images or numbers or whatever as they're with you, as they're moving with you. And what they have done is turned your thought. They have influenced your thought to look there. Hey, look, there's the number 333. Say, hey, it's like you're driving along in your car and somebody says, hey, look at that. That's what's going on. They see things around you because they're aware of you and your life and as you're moving through it. And they can influence your thoughts to look somewhere. So that's how synchronicities work. And so what's really powerful about that is that it's not that, oh, there's a number 333, for example, that I associate with my cousin. It becomes what it is my cousin is here and has told me to look there. And now all of a sudden you're aware that their presence is present. This is not just some abstraction. Do you see the difference? Much more powerful when we realize that we're seeing the sign because they are present and have asked us to look there. So this is the magic of synchronicities, that there's a whole deeper level to the synchronicity than just seeing a number or a license plate or whatever, And so so you can ask your loved ones. You're not sort of just sitting there hoping. They can hear your thoughts. It's important to understand. We can often feel their thoughts touch our mind, very often. happens in the synchronicities. It can also happen, I know this, you could be just washing the dishes, for example, and just thinking about the bills you have to pay or whatever. And then all of a sudden, a completely unconnected memory of your loved one pops into your mind. And you think, oh, I've just thought of my mother. Well, you didn't, because the mind doesn't work like that. And the more mindful we get, the more we recognize how the mind moves. The mind moves through rumination. We have this thought, it leads to the next one, it leads to the next one. So if something comes along and sort of almost interrupts that train of thought, that rumination of thought, and now all of a sudden, completely out of the blue, thought just sort of hops into your head. What that is your loved one is interrupting your thoughts. And you think, oh, I've just thought of them. Well, in fact, they just thought of you, and you felt their thought touch your mind.
I mean, beautifully explained. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of my mother who's transitioned, and she keeps coming into my thoughts.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's important to remember that. And this is why I'm a big advocate for mindfulness, for meditation, for attunement practices, because the more familiar we become with how our own mind works, then the more clear we are about when somebody we love has just interrupted our thoughts, or when somebody we love has just influenced our thoughts to see something that they've pointed to us to look at. We start becoming aware of that. We start becoming aware of when you suddenly feel this calmness come over you, for example, that your mother has sat down to give you a hug. That your mother is holding you in that moment, and this is why I find is much more powerful when it comes to sustaining those relationships than looking for a rainbow or a feather. I'm not discounting that, but the feeling and the connection that comes from understanding the nature of the mind, the nature of the connection of our thoughts, the connection, our sensitivity, we actually feel their presence. We can feel their presence, and that is possible. It doesn't have to be, oh, I just saw a feather. And I'm not discounting that, because I always see feathers from my dad. My dad used to have all these birds. And I sat in a church one time. I was sitting there with my hands, fold one hand in the other, fold like this. And the windows were all closed, the doors were all closed, and we're just sort of sitting there. And I was sitting there for maybe 20 minutes in meditation. I sort of opened my eyes. And as I opened my eyes, a little feather was landing in the palm of my hand.
Incredible.
And I thought, that's my dad, because I associate the feathers with my dad, the pennies with my granddad, for example, these sorts of things. And so I would say to somebody, ask them, show me something so I know it's you, but also pay attention to what is important to them, because they'll use those things. What are they associated with? And then they'll use those things. So you're not, because a lot of people, I think, unfortunately go around saying, I saw Robin, I wonder if that's my gran, or I saw this. Ask them. Talk to them. They can hear your thoughts. They can hear you when you talk to them.
As you talk, it's so comforting, and thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question from my human perspective. What is the afterlife like?
So, yeah, that's the $1 million question, really. So I can only talk about that because I don't have any memories of my pre-incarnation to really draw on. I think, and this is sort of a bit of me putting on my academic hat here as well, is that we really need to be very, very aware that our perception greatly creates our reality, or how we perceive reality. So, if, for example, an alien came to Earth and somebody said, oh, what's the Earth like? And somebody landed in the Sahara and somebody landed in the Antarctic, their experience would give them completely different perspective of what the Earth is like. And the thing about languages is that it has evolved to describe our physical universe. We have words to describe what's in our physical universe. We don't have words to describe what's not, which is why the word ineffable is used all the time for every writer. I'll tell you, it's a very frustrating word, because it's there because we can't quite capture the experience, because there is no language to describe it. So I think it's important to remember that. I have, in the sort of hypnagogic state, or in visitation dreams with my partner, for instance, seen colors that I knew what they were in the dream, but could not describe them to you now, and certainly couldn't name them. And I'd be like, well, it was sort of a bit sort of red, but a bit this, and everything pales because nothing captures it. So I think we need to be okay with knowing that we don't have an understanding of that world that we can actually then translate into English. So even in mediumship, we are always approximating things to be able to translate them into a language our sitter understands. So I think that's one important thing. What we do seem to know about the afterlife is it's tiered. It continues. We don't just die, pop off, and there we are. That there is an eternal progression, that this is one stage of a continued progression. And, you know, in all honesty, there's probably a stage before this one. This is the one we're in, we'll get to the next one, the next one. That's a lot of what the research I was doing was looking at as well, was these theories that have come from philosophers and religious folks and all the rest, that we continue to grow and evolve and heal over time. We know, for example, the spirit guides that we work with, that we become aware of, are much higher and much farther along in this evolutionary development than, say, we are, or even our loved ones are, you know. And so we do know that it's a continued, which I find fabulous, because I thought, you know, landing in one place and being there forever for all eternity, God, how dull does that sound, you know? But the fact that we know that people continue to grow and evolve and heal and continue on and on and on, and, you know, eventually, presumably, will achieve a point where you can become this spirit guide, this embodiment of wisdom and compassion. You know, it's marvelous, really, I think.
Yes.
And I think that lots of people have had out-of-body experiences and near-death experience. Now, there's a lot of commonalities across them, but there's also an awful lot of differences across them. So, for instance, it's rare to find a Hindu near-death experience where they meet Jesus, or a Christian's near-death experience where they meet Krishna, for example, because our perception will provide what is comfortable for us in that space, you know. And so I feel like once we can get used to the idea that perception is very, very fluid and very personal, then we can see that the spirit world is most likely as diverse as this, more likely far more diverse than this, and far more thought responsive. So I know that's probably a very disappointing answer for lots of people. I find it quite exciting.
It was a beautiful answer, and thank you so much. And as you mentioned with near-death experiences, many people that have a near-death experience say, I can't describe what I experienced or the emotions in words. Like even the word love just does not give it justice.
Absolutely.
To the feeling, the emotion, the all-encompassing experience.
Absolutely. And I've sort of had glimpses of that. And the only word I can use to describe it is bliss. And as you say, even that falls short. Even that falls short. That I've had these, and people get very caught up in reincarnation. Western concepts of reincarnation is the desire is to keep recycling through lives, whereas reincarnation in the East is to get out.
Yes, I'm never coming back. That's what many people say.
Yeah, the goal is not to come back. The goal is to advance to nirvana. In the West, and I think it's partly because we've got more of an egoic kind of approach to life, where we're very much more about individuality and separation and self. Whereas in Buddhism, for example, there is no self. There's just the stream. But we understand from consciousness theory now that that's much closer to that concept than the idea of, you know, these very finite little separate boxes that we call bodies that we exist in. But I had this, you know, just talking about that reincarnation idea, I had this fleeting experience of that bliss, for want of a completely inadequate word to describe it. And it was so unbelievably powerful. I can't, again, describe it, the experience, but there was just such a completely deep sense of belonging and acceptance and kindness and compassion and love, and all of those words, as you said yourself, pale and fail to describe the experience. But again, you sort of were trying to translate. But when I had, and it was a fleeting experience, but it really, really has stayed with me. And I thought, why would anybody who could die and in discarnate form experience that bliss want to come back into this form? You know, and I think that a lot of that is about the uncertainty. It's the fear of not existing anymore that comes from, oh, I'm going to keep reincarnating, I'm going to continue to exist. But when we realize that we continue to exist in discarnate form, and we experience that level of bliss and ecstasy and love as a normal way of being, then all of a sudden it becomes, I'm just going to stay here, just going to keep moving forward from here.
Thank you, Karen. A few more questions, if that's okay. But first, where can people connect with you? And I will leave a link below in the show notes.
Oh, yeah. So anybody who wants to just pop along can go along to my website. It's KarenFrancesMcCarthy.com. It's Frances with an E. And, you know, I have a free community there. We have a free library of recorded meditations. I have a whole section on recommended reading. I'm a huge advocate of education, because the more educated we can be, the more helpful we can be. And the more educated we are, the more superstition and perception and false beliefs and all of that sort of stuff get eradicated from what we're doing. There's talks, there's a whole range. We've got a massive community there of a lot of free content, really, to help educate and get practices for people to do who are interested in that. So that's my spirits-based community, and that's free to join. And I also have, for anybody who's interested in the things that you and I are talking about here in terms of developing the sensitivity, understanding how signs work, for example, these sorts of things. I actually created a little program called Eternal Bonds, which is designed to really normalize this and to help people to develop that sort of sensitivity and that understanding, to be able to continue relationships with their loved ones in a healthy way. It's all about continue it in a healthy way, and learn to be that. So those are all there. And, you know, and there's other stuff on the website. You can go, we also have a little Facebook community for people to meet each other, to share stories as well. So people are welcome to do that too. So that's KarenFrancesMcCarthy.com.
Thank you. And I will leave a link. I mean, it's really comforting from your experiences to almost validate, I guess probably is the word, but words don't do it justice, that death is not the end. Death of the physical body is not the end. What would be your advice? And I think it's probably the biggest fear in the world for people that are afraid of dying.
So I think the dying part, it can be unnerving. I think there's a difference between the fear of dying and the fear of being dead, because obviously there's no death, right? So the fear of dying, sometimes there's a fear around that. Am I going to get old or infirm or sick? Will I have no one to take care of me? Those are real things, real things that we just need to, practical things that we need to try to, as best as we can, mitigate. But anybody who's afraid of dying and being dead, for example, I think the only real, and actually it's a really important question, Louisa, because Ernest Becker has done a lot of study on this, he's passed now, but that our fear of death creates such a fear within us that it actually can lead to violence. And there's been a lot of study on that. And I think it's really important for the peace and harmony of the planet to sort of eradicate that fear of death by learning to understand there is no death. But there's a couple of things that are I think can be quite helpful. One is having education, doing some of these sensitizing exercises, understanding, recognizing the synchronicities in the world, recognizing that there is another power present in this world, helps us to feel that we are not disconnected, disjointed, that we are part of something greater than ourselves. And when we can really understand that we're part of something greater, that helps to take away some of that death anxiety, some of anxiety generally. The other thing, and I've given talks on this before, is there is always a gathering. Nobody dies alone. I know this there's thousands of stories. I know this from my own personal experience of sitting at deathbeds and being aware of other people that have passed. in the spirit world, gathering. So I always know if somebody is about to transition, a couple of days, 2, 3, 4 days before they transition, I start to become aware of a gathering, start to become very aware of relatives who have passed on. And when I start becoming aware of a lot of relatives starting to gather, I know the person's about to go. So that's happened with my mother, happened with my uncle, where you're like, oh, the gathering is here. They have come for the loved one to collect them and bring them home. So nobody dies alone. And this goes back to what I said earlier, is that often sitting at the deathbed, and people who are death doulas talk about this all the time, palliative care nurses talk about this a lot. People who are on the cusp of dying will start talking to invisible people in the room because it becomes so natural for them that the distinction, that the veil thins to such a degree that they no longer see a distinction between their loved ones who are in the physical form and their loved ones who are in spirit form. It becomes the same thing. And the fact that there is half a room there to send them off and there is half a room there to welcome them, I think can take away a huge amount of that fear, that those people that you love will be there when it's your time to go. So you will never be alone. There will always be somebody to take you. And there's always quite a lot of people, actually. And it happens, and it's not just somebody who's sick, where it's a known passing. I've had people in mediumship sessions, somebody who died in an accident. The car went on fire and they very, very quickly. So they had an impact and they were dead. And I've been able to describe the person who had come from them. So there's this person is there at that moment, this person is there, and I've described the person who was there, and that person was known to the sitter, was another relative, whatever. So the spirit world always knows, doesn't matter how sudden it is. The spirit world knows somebody is about to pass, and they will be ready to make sure they're there to take them by the hand and help them with that transition, which is hugely comforting, because now we know that all our loved ones who have gone on before will be back to help us at the end.
Thank you, Karen. I mean, your words just feel so good and so comforting. I guess my final question to you would be grief. I know you suffered intense grief with the loss of your fiance, and perhaps many of this audience is watching or listening to this interview. How to deal with grief? What do we do, and how do we move through it? And there's so many questions. Do we ever get over it?
Yeah, well, we never get over grief. We learn it becomes part of the fabric of who we are, and we learn to live with it. And that actually, I think, is a very positive thing, because sometimes when people have been through intense grief, there can be a very deep seasoning with that. I've found some of the kindest, most compassionate people that I know are the people who have suffered greatly in many cases, because when you understand suffering, you understand that suffering is universal. We're all suffering in one way, shape, or form. I mean, this is the tenet of Buddhism. All life is suffering, right? And we can become. It can make us a little bit more humble, or there's a humility attached to it that in turn can make us more compassionate. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful gift that exists within grief. So I think what's important with grief is that everybody grieves in their own way. And everybody will grieve for as long as they need to grieve. And so you often hear, I used to hear this all the time when my partner, a few months, 3 months later, maybe you'll meet somebody else. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? Why would you say that? Not only now am I grieving the loss of my loved one, you're trying to put me into a situation where now I feel like I'm going to be cheating. Like, I'm not in that space. I think a lot of the time is people don't know what to say to grieving people. And so they say things that are completely unhelpful. Oh, you've been grieving too long. It's been a year. Who said you can only grieve for a year? Do you think a mother is going to only grieve their child for a year? So people, I think, need to just recognize that other people are trying to be helpful and are usually very misguided. And that it is important for people to be compassionate towards the self, to be kind to the self, to allow yourself grieve. Grief is a manifestation of very, very deep love. you know. So, and I'm not saying that we want to be going on where we're still in our pajamas in 5 years, but I do feel that grief is an evolving process and it changes over time. You know, I'm still, my father died 5 years ago. I still, you know, but I can get on with my life, but I still have these heartfelt moments. Fortunately for me, I can say, Daddy, there, you know, but we need to we need to treat ourselves with great amount of gentleness and compassion and kindness when we're grieving. And if somebody is trying to push you forward or push you into something else, you're going to have to try to find a way to ask them to not do that, or step back from them if it's harming you. I think it's always good to find, if you're having a particularly struggling and it's been quite a while and you're still really struggling, I think it would be important to find a grief counselor or find a grief support group or find a community of faith or something like that, where you can just sort of be with your grief. You know, we need to just be allowed to be with our grief. A lot of the time in our society, people are very uncomfortable with grief and they're always trying to push it away or hide it away, or, you know, we need to just be allowed to be with it. It's an expression of our love.
Dr. McCarthy, thank you and a big congratulations on your doctorate. On a final note, is there anything you'd like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that we haven't discussed today?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, be optimistic, be hopeful. There is so much love there, whether you feel it or not. There's so much love surrounding you all of the time. Your loved ones are only ever a thought away. You can always talk to them. You're never holding them back, interfering, getting in the way. You know, your loved ones are, it's like you're at work, you get a text from your loved one. Are you going to be annoyed about it? Of course not. You talk to them, talk to your loved ones, engage with them. They will find a way to answer you.
Thank you so much, and a beautiful way to end the show, Dr. Karen Frances McCarthy. Thank you so much for being on Passion Harvest.
Thank you, Louisa. Always lovely to be here.
Oh, a pleasure. Bye-bye.